Landon Aiden had never been a man in search of conflict. At 48, he had built a quiet, deliberate life, one measured not by noise but by the weight of decisions made carefully, deliberately. After years of consulting in industrial safety across the Midwest, he had grown tired of the endless motion. Airports, hollow handshakes, risk assessments dictated by spreadsheets rather than common sense. It wasn't burnout. It was erosion, the slow wearing away of purpose by bureaucracy. So when the opportunity came to purchase a modest, neglected property in northern Montana, 58 acres of rugged, elevated land, brushed by wind and silence, he didn't hesitate. He liquidated an old investment account, signed the purchase without fanfare, and left behind the city, the contracts, and the mild corporate tension that always hovered like a dull ache behind his eyes. The property had history. It had belonged to a man named Gerald Langford, a semi-retired carpenter who'd passed away without heirs. The land, bordering on forest preserve and high brush, wasn't flat or orderly. It rolled and dipped unpredictably, and the house at its center, a squat two-story post and beam structure, was in disrepair but salvageable. Landon didn't see ruin. He saw structure, integrity, bones. He brought in a local crew to rewire the electrical, replace the septic, reinforce the joists. He didn't aim to modernize, just to restore. He worked alongside them quietly, learning the weather patterns, the soil composition, the way the land creaked when it settled after rain. The area was remote enough that the nearest gas station was 20 minutes out, and the closest neighbor's property line was technically a quarter-mile south, marked only by a shallow dry creek and a rusted fence post from who knew when. But there was one house nearby that stood out. About 600 feet to the east, slightly uphill, perched an angular, newly constructed, modern-style home. Glass and concrete and white panel siding that gleamed like bone in sunlight. It didn't match the landscape, but it had presence. That home belonged to a woman named Karen Trammell, whom Landon had met only once in passing during his first week, when she approached his drive uninvited. She had introduced herself with a fixed smile, manicured hands folded neatly in front of her, as if conducting an open house rather than a neighborly greeting. "You must be the new arrival. I'm Karen. This land has been quiet for a long time. I hope you'll be responsible with it." There was no warmth in the statement, only suggestion, vague and heavy. Landon had nodded, said something courteous, and made a mental note to avoid unnecessary conversations. He had seen enough of her type in boardrooms, people who spoke in the language of veiled authority, as if their approval were something you should want. For the first few months, life settled into rhythm. Mornings were coffee and maintenance, fixing fencing, trimming brush, walking the perimeter. Afternoons he spent inside drafting part-time consulting reports from his makeshift home office, and evenings were often spent on the porch, watching the tree line shift colors in the fading light. It wasn't exciting, but it was grounded, the kind of solitude he hadn't realized he'd craved. There were no disputes, no disturbances, just space, sky, and air so clean, it felt almost intrusive to breathe. But small things began to happen. At first they were nothing. Minor observations he brushed off. A pile of broken branches stacked strangely near his southern boundary. Orange surveyor's tape tied around a sapling he hadn't marked. Deep tire grooves on the eastern side of his land where no road existed. Each event isolated, excusable. A deer, maybe, a utility crew, wind. He didn't dwell on them. But the sense that something was being tracked, measured, or subtly repositioned began to nudge at the back of his mind like a stone in a shoe. The first actual confrontation came one gray afternoon in early spring, when he noticed a small, laminated placard staked into the ground just past the old creek bed. It read, "Restoration Zone. Entry prohibited." It had an official look, bold black type, some insignia in the corner, but it was planted squarely on his side of the boundary. Landon stood there for a long minute, arms folded, wind tugging at the edges of his flannel shirt. He didn't touch the sign. Instead, he walked back, pulled his parcel documentation, and confirmed what he already knew. That area, every inch of it, was his land. He removed the placard and placed it in his shed. The next day, it returned, but farther in, and this time accompanied by 2 fluorescent markers and a sheet of paper taped to a tree. The document, printed on standard office stock, bore the heading Interim Use Restriction, Habitat Assessment Pending. No signature, no agency listed. Just bureaucratic jargon floating in white space like an orphaned threat. Landon didn't play the guessing game. He called the local zoning office. No such designation had been filed. No habitat assessment. No restricted access. They told him if someone was placing unauthorized notices, they were in the wrong. That night, as he locked up the shed, he caught a glimpse of movement near the boundary. A flashlight flicker, then darkness. Too far to confront. He didn't chase. He simply stood by the porch light for several minutes, watching, not breathing heavily, just present. This wasn't a horror story. He wasn't scared. He was alert. That kind of watchfulness that comes not from paranoia, but from experience. An instinct built over time. It wasn't until the sheriff's deputy arrived 2 weeks later that the shape of the conflict revealed itself. Landon had been hauling brush when the squad car rolled down the gravel drive. The deputy was polite, respectful, but his questions were sharp around the edges. "There's been a report," he said, "that you've been occupying land that might not fall within your parcel. I need to ask if you're aware of any disputes." Landon blinked once, then handed him the full set of deeds, maps, and transfer papers he kept in a binder in his truck. The deputy examined them, nodded. "This is thorough. I'm going to make a note of this. I don't think there's an issue here, but you may want to expect a follow-up." "What's the nature of the complaint?" Landon asked. The deputy hesitated. "Neighbor claims the boundary line was misrepresented at the time of your purchase, that you've expanded into a common zone." "Common zone," Landon echoed. "There's no common zone. This isn't a development." "Like I said," the deputy replied, "I'm just documenting. No action from our end unless something escalates." And that was the turning point. Landon knew in that moment that this wasn't going to be a neighborly misunderstanding. It wasn't a one-time dispute over a tree line or a fence. It was strategic, coordinated, planned. Someone had decided to push, and they were using the language of policy, not confrontation. It wouldn't come in the form of trespassers with signs, but with paper, process, and presence. Someone wanted part of his land, or wanted him gone from it, and they were moving methodically. The question wasn't if it would escalate, but how far, and how ready he was to meet it. Not with violence, not with posturing, but with clarity, with lawful certainty, and with the steady, unshakable truth that this land was his. And he would defend it. The letter arrived folded into thirds, tucked into a thin manila envelope without a return address. Landon found it late one afternoon, wedged between a catalog he hadn't subscribed to and a water bill in the rusted metal box at the foot of his drive. At first he assumed it was another generic mailing, an insurance ad, a warranty scam, something forgettable. But when he slid a thumb beneath the flap and pulled out the single page inside, his attention sharpened immediately. The letter was not printed on official county stationery, nor did it bear any department seal, yet it was structured like something institutional. The language was clipped and performative, almost legalistic in tone but devoid of real authority. It opened with a warning. Continued presence and unauthorized improvements within environmentally sensitive border zones may result in civil penalties and revocation of land use rights, pending regional assessment. No signatory, no source. The only identifier was a faint watermark in the corner. MT Common Access Zone Initiative, followed by a numerical string that resembled a parcel ID but didn't match anything from his deed. Landon read it twice, standing beside the open mailbox, wind tugging at the corners of the page. The document suggested that his recent work, clearing underbrush, placing small markers for fencing, rerouting surface water away from the house, was in direct violation of an ecological directive he'd never heard of. It instructed him to cease all activity within the disputed corridor and report to a compliance consultation at an address in town. He folded the paper slowly and returned to the house, his expression unreadable. There was no panic in him, only the tension of recognition. This wasn't a simple neighbor's complaint, it was the start of a campaign. Someone wanted to push him off balance, get him second-guessing, uncertain, and the most efficient way to do that was to dress a lie in the uniform of authority. He didn't waste time. Within the hour, he was at his desk with the plat map spread out across the surface, tracing boundary lines with a pencil, confirming coordinates against the county's online database. Nothing had changed. His land extended from the western ridge to the edge of the dry creek and followed the old logging trail that cut diagonally across the base of the hill. Everything the letter referred to as border zones was well within his legal boundary. Just to be thorough, he contacted the county assessor's office and requested confirmation in writing. The clerk he spoke to, a young man named Kevin, was polite but confused. "There's no MT Common Access Zone designation anywhere in our system," he said. "That sounds like a private program. Maybe a conservation group?" Landon thanked him, hung up, and made copies of the letter. He stored one with his legal documents and brought another to his attorney's office the next morning. He didn't need a fight, but he wasn't going to sit back and be slowly edged out by procedural nonsense. His attorney, a seasoned woman named Joanna Reeve, reviewed the letter carefully, her face betraying a flicker of irritation as she scanned the language. "This is bluff work," she said, tapping the page. "It's designed to sound like a warning, but isn't enforceable by any known authority. You're not obligated to respond to this, but they're clearly testing you." A day later, a white SUV appeared at the edge of his property. It parked at a crooked angle near the dry creek bed and remained idle for nearly 20 minutes. Landon watched from the porch, noting the tinted windows, the lack of plates on the front bumper. He didn't approach. Eventually, the SUV backed up slowly and disappeared down the gravel road. That night, while checking the perimeter, he discovered 2 new markers near the eastern fence. Thin wooden stakes painted red at the tips, driven into the ground at irregular intervals. They weren't survey stakes. They weren't even aligned to any rational property line. They were symbols, declarations. Psychological warfare executed with a hammer and spray paint. 2 days later, it escalated again. Landon had driven into town to pick up a shipment of lumber and supplies, and when he returned, a sheriff's cruiser was parked in front of his gate. The deputy, different from the last one, was speaking with someone Landon couldn't see from the road. As he pulled closer, he recognized the voice before the figure. Karen. She stood with arms crossed, speaking in hushed tones, her tone calibrated to suggest urgency without theatrics. When she noticed Landon's truck, she took a deliberate step back and gestured toward the creek. The deputy raised a hand, motioning for Landon to stop a few feet short. The conversation was brief, quiet, controlled. Karen claimed Landon had been altering drainage routes in a way that caused soil destabilization near her foundation. She said she'd witnessed him dumping material into the creek, redirecting flow, and violating local environmental codes. She insisted he had crossed into her land repeatedly and without permission. Landon, calm and silent, waited for the deputy to finish relaying the complaint before responding. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't appeal emotionally. He handed the deputy a printed copy of the county's topographical assessment, pointed out the natural slope, and explained the erosion control measures he'd installed, approved and documented with photos. He even offered to have a third-party environmental engineer inspect the area, at his own cost. The deputy, younger than the first, seemed caught between neutrality and fatigue. "I can't enforce property lines," he said. "That's civil, but I'd advise you to limit activity near the creek until this is resolved. Just keep things calm." Landon nodded, but he knew what this was. The complaint wasn't meant to hold up in court. It was meant to buy time, to accumulate paper, position, narrative. It was about perception, positioning him as an aggressor, a disruptor. One false move, one flared temper, and Karen would have her next complaint ready. Landon didn't give it to her. Instead, he called a land use mediator, an independent contractor certified by the state, and scheduled a neutral site assessment. He submitted a formal request for boundary reaffirmation through the county's property office and logged the complaint with his attorney, ensuring a paper trail of his own, but the pressure mounted. Later that week, a second letter arrived. This one printed on letterhead that bore a more refined version of the previous watermark, accompanied by a fabricated departmental code. It warned of pending evaluation for non-compliance and cited unresolved territorial encroachments. Landon scanned it, added it to the growing file, and tightened his focus. He began recording dates, interactions, vehicle sightings. He upgraded the exterior cameras, not as a weapon, but as insurance. Every step he took was calculated, measured, within the law. The final straw, however, came not through paper, but through presence. One afternoon, while inspecting the edge of his property line, Landon found a makeshift garden bed. a neat rectangle of turned soil and carefully placed stones installed just across the dry creek on his side of the property. Freshly planted, watered, and staked with a plastic tag that read, Community Restoration Plot Number 3, Trammell Biodiversity Project. It was deliberate, permanent looking, and it carried one message. You do not control this land. He didn't tear it up. He didn't call the sheriff. He called Joanna. We need to accelerate, he said. I want formal enforcement of the property boundaries. I want a civil injunction. And I want it on record that any further physical alterations to my land will constitute actionable trespass. Joanna agreed, and just like that, the tone shifted. It was no longer a question of conflict avoidance. It was about defense, precedent, and position. Landon understood the rules of engagement now, and he wasn't about to lose the land he had claimed, not to confusion, not to manipulation, and certainly not to someone who mistook quiet for weakness. The wind shifted. It wasn't a dramatic change, no thunderclap, no moment of revelation, but a subtle, cumulative turn in the atmosphere, the kind of pressure change that animals sense long before a storm. Landon felt it not in the trees or the air, but in the behavior of people. Subtle glances, small delays in conversations, things left unsaid in the post office or hardware store. He wasn't imagining it. He was being watched, by whom he could guess, but the details remained murky. What became clear, however, was that Karen had shifted tactics. The passive-aggressive boundary games had served their purpose. To bait a reaction, to provoke him into acting irrationally or overstepping some invisible social line. But Landon hadn't taken the bait. He'd remained calm, precise, legally methodical. That resistance seemed to harden her strategy rather than deter it. The first active move came through infrastructure, the most common and invisible weapon in rural conflict. On a Monday morning, Landon received a notification from the county maintenance office stating that his primary access road, technically a private easement, was scheduled for temporary closure due to grading and runoff mitigation. The letter was bland, procedural, but Landon knew every inch of that road. No maintenance had been performed on it in over a decade, and it had no structural issues to warrant such a project. He called the office and was passed through 2 departments before a woman in operations admitted, hesitantly, that the request for the maintenance project had been submitted as a community petition, citing safety concerns and unregulated use. When Landon asked for names, he was told the petition was filed under concerned residents. The implications were immediate. The closure, though temporary, would cut off the main entrance to his property. Deliveries, contractor visits, even emergency access would be routed through a narrow, poorly maintained trail that wound around the eastern ridge, barely wide enough for one vehicle and impassable in bad weather. Karen's house, on the other hand, sat at the mouth of the main easement. Blocking it didn't just inconvenience him, it enhanced her control. Landon didn't waste time arguing. Instead, he contacted his attorney and initiated an emergency review of the easement agreement, submitting documents that proved uninterrupted, historic use, and requesting a halt on any unauthorized work. Within 48 hours, the county paused the closure, citing unclear easement priority, and scheduled a hearing to reassess public versus private access claims. But the damage wasn't in the road, it was in the message. This was no longer just about boundaries, it was about leverage. And that shift rippled through every layer of Landon's life. Packages began to arrive late or not at all. One morning he found that his propane delivery had been marked inaccessible, despite clear skies and an open drive. When he called the supplier, the dispatcher apologized, explaining that their driver had been told the property was under review for environmental zoning, and they were advised not to proceed without confirmation. Landon demanded details. The dispatcher mentioned a woman from the committee who'd flagged it. No name, no authority, just influence disguised as process. Simultaneously, his interactions in town grew more strained. At the co-op store, the clerk who'd always greeted him with a nod now avoided his eyes. At the feed supplier, an order he'd placed for erosion matting was delayed twice. The second time accompanied by an offhand comment about possible development-free zones. The entire area, it seemed, was being wrapped in red tape. But selectively, and only when it involved Landon's parcel. He responded as he always did, with precision. He filed formal inquiries, demanded written explanations, and documented every delay, every interference. But it was exhausting, and that was part of the design. Death by 1,000 procedural cuts. Meanwhile, Karen kept her distance physically, but her presence was felt in the effects of her coordination. And then came the boldest incursion yet. On a cold morning in late March, Landon awoke to the sound of unfamiliar engines outside. When he stepped onto the porch, he saw a pair of surveyors, yellow vests, tripods, reflective gear, setting up equipment near the edge of the dry creek. One of them glanced up, startled to see him so early. "Morning," he offered, neutral but uneasy. "We're conducting an environmental overlay scan. Temporary field study." Landon didn't react visibly. He approached slowly, scanning their credentials. They were contracted through a private engineering firm, Eco Restoration West, out of Missoula. He asked who had authorized the work. The man hesitated, then replied, "Landowner on the adjacent parcel. Ms. Trammell, she's seeking to certify the corridor as a transitional wildlife buffer." Landon breathed in through his nose and exhaled slowly. He didn't argue. He simply stated calmly that the area in which they were standing was not part of her parcel, and until they could produce legal documentation authorizing activity on his land, they were to cease operations immediately. He gave them the option to leave or face civil trespass. They packed up within minutes and left. That same evening, Landon received a message from Joanna. "We need to meet in person," she said. "Something's moving." When they sat down 2 days later, she laid out a file, printed pages, correspondence, copies of petitions, and email threads. It wasn't official yet, but Karen, it seemed, had contacted a regional conservation group with ties to a private donor network. Using selective language and partial maps, she was attempting to designate the corridor between their properties as a community conservation easement, a legal mechanism that could, if passed, impose limitations on land use even without full consent, under certain local ordinances. The strategy was brutal in its elegance. It didn't require taking his land, just regulating it into paralysis. No building, no fencing, no grading, no usage without oversight. The only thing worse than losing land was owning it and being forbidden to use it. Landon stared at the file, hands resting calmly on the table. How far can they push this? Joanna leaned forward. Depends on how much community support she gets. If she controls the narrative and you're framed as the obstructionist, this becomes a battle of image as much as law. He didn't blink. Then we stopped playing defense. Over the next week, Landon took action, not through confrontation, but through execution. He retained an independent appraiser to document current usage of his land and any changes since his purchase. He brought in a second environmental consultant, this time one certified by the state, to walk the property and issue a formal land use compatibility assessment. He met with county officials, not to protest, but to inform. This was what was happening. Here were the documents. Here were the patterns of abuse. Each meeting was professional, fact-based, and delivered without drama. He wasn't building a case. He was building certainty. And then he made one quiet move. He hired a mediator, not for Karen, but for the community. A retired judge who offered neutral reviews of land disputes and was respected in the area. His purpose wasn't to solve the issue, but to shine light on it, to bring form to the vague tension now seeping through the valley. Karen's reaction was immediate. She filed a formal complaint with the mediator's office, claiming Landon was harassing her through legal theater. But it was too late. The tide had begun to turn. Neighbors who had remained silent started asking questions. A local property blogger picked up the term weaponized conservation and published a short piece titled, "When Green Becomes Control." Still, Landon knew it wasn't over. He hadn't won anything, he had only shifted momentum, and that was all he needed. He wasn't looking for revenge. He didn't want a spectacle, he just wanted peace. But now he understood what kind of force he was up against, and he would not yield another inch. The first time Landon sat across from Karen in a formal setting, it wasn't in a courtroom or a sheriff's office. It was in a converted city building downtown used for community mediation sessions, its beige walls and dusty plastic blinds doing their best to create a sense of neutrality. The room smelled of disinfectant and old carpet, and the table between them was too wide to feel conversational, but not wide enough to eliminate tension. Karen arrived 5 minutes late, perfectly put together in a sand-colored blouse, understated jewelry, and a polite smile that said everything and nothing at once. She carried a folder with decorative tabs and unmarked sheets, and behind her followed a younger woman introduced only as her liaison, who remained silent and took notes like a court reporter. Landon brought only what mattered: a folder with 3 items, an official copy of his deed, a certified survey of the property boundaries, and a notarized letter from the county zoning department affirming the absence of any conservation designation within his land. The mediator, a middle-aged man with a background in land use law, opened the session calmly, outlining the format and setting ground rules. He asked each party to explain their perspective. Karen went first. Her voice was smooth, her cadence rehearsed, her narrative structured to appeal to sensibility, not legality. She spoke of community vision, of shared environmental values, of her deep concern over the impact of recent grading on wildlife flow and aquifer exposure. She described Landon's actions as overzealous improvements and insisted that her only goal was to preserve the natural integrity of the corridor. Language that carefully tiptoed around terms like property line or ownership, though every word implied that Landon had somehow violated both. When it was his turn, Landon did not argue tone with tone. He didn't meet her warmth with sarcasm or call her claims ridiculous. He laid out the documents one by one, explaining the legal boundary, the permitted modifications, and the certified status of his land under state and county jurisdiction. He clarified that none of his actions exceeded the scope of private ownership or required her approval. The mediator listened attentively, nodded, asked a few technical follow-ups, and then turned to Karen. "Do you have any documentation that contradicts Mr. Aiden's survey or deed?" She paused, offering a slow smile before sliding a single sheet across the table. It was a hand-drawn map, stylized with color-coded lines and notations. "This is what was passed down to me by my family," she said softly. "It shows how the land was originally used before it was sold piecemeal." The mediator examined it without expression. "Is this map recorded with the county?" Karen's smile didn't falter. "No, but it reflects the practical boundaries everyone respected for years." "There's no legal weight here," the mediator replied. "It can't override registered documentation." Karen leaned back gently, her smile growing thinner. "I understand. I'm not trying to fight Mr. Aiden. I'm simply asking for cooperation. Compromise. Isn't that why we're here?" Landon watched her carefully. She was shifting again, retreating from legal footing to the realm of social optics, where pressure is applied not through rules but through implication. He could see it clearly now. Her strategy wasn't to win outright. It was to trap him in a corner where refusal made him the problem, where every justified defense could be recast as aggression. He said nothing. The mediator concluded the session by recommending that both parties avoid further action until a formal land use audit could be completed. But the subtext was clear. Legally, Landon had ground. Socially, Karen was gaining shadows. He left the building not angry, but sobered. This wasn't about one woman. It was about how systems could be bent, not through brute force, but through narratives, relationships, and reputations. In the following week, small things began to add weight to that understanding. A local newsletter appeared at the diner featuring an anonymous op-ed praising citizens who care about natural heritage, and subtly criticizing those who see land as territory, not trust. The piece didn't name him, but it didn't have to. Neighbors who once waved now hesitated. 2 people he'd hired for occasional cleanup stopped responding to calls. Joanna warned him that Karen's push toward a conservation easement was regaining traction with a newly recruited regional advocate who'd taken an interest in the area. If they could argue that the land qualified for provisional status due to historic ecological significance, they might trigger a state review. Even if ultimately unsuccessful, the process could freeze development for months. "It's not a win," Joanna said, "but it's enough to paralyze you." That was the tactic all along. Not a clear victory, but paralysis. Wear him down, isolate him, box him in until he's sold out of exhaustion. But Landon didn't scare. He acted. He filed a motion to preemptively block any provisional easement designation, citing active use and documented improvements. He requested an administrative hearing at the state level and secured a preemptive land appraisal to challenge any future undervaluation. Quietly, without telling even Joanna, he installed a buried perimeter cable with legal signage and informed the sheriff's office in writing that any physical interference with that line would be treated as criminal trespass under Montana State Code. And still, through all of this, Karen never raised her voice, never lost her composure. She sent a fruit basket to the county records office with a thank you note for their hard work. She hosted a small nature walk for children from a local private school, which happened to pass right alongside the disputed boundary. She continued to weaponize civility in a way that felt impossible to counter. Until one day, the civility cracked. Landon had returned from a day trip to the nearby town for supplies. When he pulled into his drive, he saw two unfamiliar cars parked just beyond the dry creek, inside his boundary. The makeshift garden plot was gone. In its place were 3 folding tables, a large canopy, and a dozen folding chairs set up in an arc. A printed banner read, "Ecological Future Summit, Preliminary Field Session." He stepped from his truck slowly, walking down the incline toward the clearing, where Karen stood in the center of the setup, clipboard in hand, speaking to a group of professionally dressed individuals, likely donors, stakeholders, or maybe just curious allies. When she saw him approach, she smiled as if they'd planned this meeting. "Mr. Aiden," she called out, "you're just in time. We're conducting a preliminary review of the soil zone. I hope you don't mind. This space is so crucial to our regional project." Landon didn't answer. He stopped, pulled out his phone, and dialed the sheriff's office. No anger, no performance. Just quiet, deliberate documentation. Karen stepped forward, voice lowered. "Is this really necessary?" "Yes," he said. The moment she realized he wasn't going to argue, but act cleanly, calmly, within his rights, something in her eyes hardened. For the first time, her expression lost its veil. She turned back to her group and motioned them toward the cars. Within minutes, the field was empty again. But it wasn't over. It was never going to be that easy. The war had simply changed its rules. By the time Landon received the certified notice, he was no longer surprised by the method, only by the boldness of the content. The envelope arrived late in the afternoon, hand-delivered by a courier who offered a polite nod but no explanation. Inside was a printed letter bearing the insignia of the Regional Land Use Integrity Board, a bureaucratic body he had never interacted with before. The language was crisp, official, and carefully layered in terms like emergency review, provisional halt order, and suspected non-compliance pending field verification. The document cited a petition filed on behalf of an unspecified citizens' environmental action group, requesting immediate suspension of all structural activity on Landon's property due to potential habitat disruption and unauthorized construction. No evidence was listed, no photographs attached, just the accusation and the implicit threat of state inspection. He placed the letter down slowly, took a breath, and immediately scanned and sent it to Joanna. Her response was quick and unsentimental. "They're escalating. They know your legal position is solid, so now they're trying to freeze your operational status. You're being cornered through process," Landon understood. He'd seen this tactic before in the private sector, weaponizing procedure, using the slow weight of administrative burden to exhaust the opponent not with force but with delay. But this wasn't just a project or a contract. This was his home, his land, and now even his legal right to so much as replace a fence post was under sudden scrutiny. Within 48 hours, a vehicle from the RLUIB appeared near the southern edge of his parcel. It was unmarked, save for a small magnetic seal on the passenger door, and out of it stepped a man in khakis and a bright blue vest, clipboard in hand. Landon greeted him directly, politely, and asked what authority had granted field access. The man, clearly uncomfortable but trying to maintain composure, said they were following up on flag concerns and wouldn't be long. Landon, expression flat, informed him that without a formal inspection order signed by a state magistrate or agency directive, no one had jurisdiction to conduct activity on his land. The man hesitated, mumbled something about procedural miscommunication, and returned to his vehicle. He didn't come back, but Landon knew this wasn't the end. The same night the air changed, it wasn't the weather, it was the silence. The forest line that usually hummed with life after dusk was still. No crickets, no wind in the trees. Landon stood on his porch, coffee in hand, eyes fixed on the shadows near the tree line. That's when he saw them, 3 figures, barely visible in the low light, standing just beyond the perimeter. They weren't doing anything, just observing. Too far to confront without confrontation, too close to be innocent. He didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for his phone, took a time-stamped photograph from the porch, and filed a non-emergency incident report with the sheriff's office, attaching the photo. Then he activated the new infrared camera system he'd installed quietly a month earlier, and sat down to review the past 3 nights' footage. Patterns emerged. Brief flashes of motion, lights, parked vehicles near the creek, always gone by morning. Not random, not amateur. Someone was testing his reaction window. The following morning, he received an email from the county permit office stating that a formal complaint had been filed against him for operating a non-permitted structure within an easement buffer. The structure in question? A storage shed he had purchased fully built and placed on a flat patch behind the main house. Well within property lines and previously cleared with the assessor during his renovation filings, the complaint, again, listed no attached evidence. Landon's response was immediate, backed with date-stamped emails, photographs, and permit confirmations. Joanna followed up with a formal counterfiling, accusing the complainant, who remained unnamed in the public document, of administrative harassment. They both knew who it was, but paper didn't accuse. It only hinted. That week, deliveries stopped altogether. His lumber order was canceled with no explanation. His propane company informed him that service had been suspended pending property access review. One of the fencing contractors he'd worked with sent a vague message apologizing and saying they had been advised to avoid engagement in flagged areas. Landon, calm as ever, simply wrote it all down, documented each change, and forwarded copies to Joanna, who was now compiling a timeline of systemic interference and reputational tampering. She began referring to it as a pattern of coercive delay. But then came the first attempt to provoke him directly. 2 men, middle-aged, unfamiliar, approached the edge of his property one afternoon, under the pretense of clarifying boundary questions on behalf of a local ecology council. They carried clipboards, looked underdressed for field work, and one of them wore brand new boots, untied. They didn't announce themselves properly. They didn't provide credentials. Instead, they asked leading questions. Who maintained the drainage channel? How far back the structures were built? Whether any work had been subcontracted. When Landon informed them they were trespassing and would need to leave, one of them raised a phone as if to film and muttered something about public oversight. Landon didn't engage. He simply said he was documenting the interaction and recording license plates. That was enough. They left, but slowly, deliberately, letting their silence weigh heavier than words. Joanna was growing increasingly concerned, not because they were winning, but because their tactics were becoming erratic. They had begun acting outside even the limited framework of bureaucratic nuisance. This was no longer just paper and noise. It was pressure. Provocation. Landon's property wasn't just a piece of land anymore, it was a symbol. He had become the test case for whether a private owner could be bent by procedural force and social isolation. And Karen, always quiet, always watching, remained the conductor of this improvised orchestra of obstruction. One morning, Landon found a handwritten note pinned under a stone on the porch railing. It read, in tight, slanted script, "Maybe it's time to leave while you still can. Nothing here is worth what's coming." There was no signature. The writing was neat, feminine, and anonymous. He didn't report it, he filed it. And that night, he reinforced the interior locks, updated his remote surveillance server, and scheduled an unannounced meeting with a former county investigator now working private security in the region. Not for retaliation, not for protection, but for a consultation. If Karen and her allies wanted escalation, they would get it, but through channels, not fury. Then, at last, the definitive escalation arrived. Not in the mail, but in his driveway. A sheriff's deputy, new face, accompanied by a code enforcement officer, requested access to the property based on credible reports of illegal grading, noise violations, and safety concerns. Landon calmly asked to see the warrant. There wasn't one, just a request. He refused access, explained that all prior activity had been permitted, inspected, and approved, and that any entry without a judicial signature would be treated as unlawful intrusion. The officer pushed gently. The deputy stood silent, clearly uncomfortable. When it became clear Landon wouldn't bend, they left. 3 hours later, he received a call from a different department. Building inspection. The same concerns. He told them what he had told the others. The law was clear. The burden of proof was not his. They'd need more than rumors and anonymous reports to touch his land. He hung up, breathed deeply, and for the first time in weeks allowed himself to feel the weight of it. Not as fear, but as a line drawn in stone. The battle had fully arrived. Not one of noise or fists, but of pressure, patience, and the ability to endure longer than those trying to exhaust him. He would endure, because this was his land, and he wasn't going anywhere. The breaking point came not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the arrival of a registered letter stamped by the District Court of Deer Ridge County. It bore a stark heading: Notice of Temporary Injunction Pending Review, and within it a 3-page motion requesting that Landon cease all land-altering activity until the court could rule on a civil petition filed by an entity titled the Trammel, Ecological Oversight Concern, which, to his unsurprise, listed Karen as its founder and primary agent. The document referenced excessive and unpermitted land disturbance, unauthorized drainage modifications, and aggressive perimeter expansion inconsistent with community integrity. But what stood out was the claim buried in the second page that Landon had forcibly removed safety installations and had verbally threatened field agents operating in a recognized conservation corridor. It was the lie they'd been circling toward for weeks, now codified into a formal accusation. Not only was she trying to stall him, now she was attempting to paint him as a violent disruptor. Joanna, reading the documents in her office 30 miles away, called him within minutes of reviewing them. They're opening a path toward a restraining order, Landon. If the court accepts this framing, even temporarily, you'll be legally restricted from your own land for the duration of the review. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the warning beneath it. This isn't about right or wrong anymore. It's about optics, urgency, and how fast they can force a reaction out of you. But Landon wasn't panicking. The pressure, for all its weight, had sharpened his focus, not dulled it. He responded not with outrage, but with leverage. The day after receiving the injunction notice, he filed a counter-motion, backed with notarized documentation, time-stamped video surveillance, a signed witness statement from the environmental consultant who'd walked the land with him, and a physical map with annotated points detailing where false installations had been removed. The linchpin of the response was a series of video clips captured on the night Karen's so-called field agents had attempted to install equipment beyond her boundary, clearly showing the trespass, the unauthorized drilling, and Landon's calm, verbal warning to vacate. Nothing threatening, no physical contact, just legal notice recorded and archived. Joanna included a supplemental motion demanding a review of Karen's legal filings for abuse of process, and submitted a private complaint to the ethics board regarding the fabricated counsel she'd registered. And for the first time in months, the procedural tide slowed, but Karen didn't retreat. 2 days later, as Landon returned from a meeting with Joanna and county assessors, he found 3 uniformed officers waiting near the edge of his property. One of them held a printed copy of the injunction request, still pending, not granted, while another was on the phone with a supervisor. Karen stood just beyond the dry creek, arms crossed, a small crowd of her supporters flanking her driveway entrance, all watching in silent expectancy. One officer approached and requested to speak with him off record. He explained that Karen had reported an imminent risk of escalation, and that the department had to respond, even if no actual violence had occurred. Landon listened, said nothing, and then walked the officer to the property line where a camera, mounted high in the trees, had recorded every minute of his arrival, his walk, and his demeanor. He handed the officer a flash drive with footage and returned to his porch without another word. The officers left 15 minutes later without incident. The onlookers dispersed. Karen did not. That evening, as dusk swallowed the property in a deep wash of gray, Landon found a new signpost hammered into the earth just on the edge of his eastern clearing. It read, "Proposed public access trailhead, subject to easement review." It had been placed in the dead of night without notice, without permit, and once again, just inches across the line. This time, Landon didn't remove it. He documented it, photographed the soil for boot prints, measured the placement relative to the known boundary, and then returned inside to complete a sworn affidavit with exact measurements and timestamps. He sent it to Joanna, who within 24 hours had filed an injunction of their own, this time demanding that Karen and her affiliates cease all attempts to unilaterally alter boundary-adjacent space without judicial or county authorization. The request was granted. Finally, officially, the court stepped in. The court hearing was scheduled just 10 days later. It was meant to be a procedural review, dry, factual, confined to property rights and boundary affirmations, but what unfolded was something else entirely. Karen, representing her organization with an attorney 2 seats down, began with a statement that bled emotion. She painted herself as a steward of local preservation, someone burdened with the thankless duty of protecting natural space from privatized overreach. She referred to Landon as uncooperative, volatile, and increasingly hostile toward community accountability. When asked for evidence, her lawyer submitted selected photographs, close crops of land disturbance, a photo of Landon holding a post hole digger near the disputed area, and a shaky video of him raising his voice toward 2 unidentified figures. But Joanna's response dismantled it all methodically. With timestamps, maps, inspection reports, video evidence of calm demeanor, and statements from neutral third parties, she reframed the narrative. Landon wasn't volatile. He was besieged, and he had not retaliated. He had defended with restraint, documentation, and the full cooperation of every authority he'd been asked to respect. The judge, a man known for his procedural discipline, requested a recess. Upon return, he delivered an interim decision. All requests by the petitioner for land use injunctions were denied. All prior filings by the Trammell Oversight Concern were placed under evidentiary review. No criminal intent or aggression was found on the part of Landon Aden. And while the matter of land boundaries was remanded for formal survey confirmation, the court found no cause to restrict his movement, use, or development rights on the parcel pending said review. In short, he had prevailed. Not finally, not fully, but enough to halt the machine that had been slowly tightening around him for months. Landon didn't smile when the gavel fell. He didn't exhale dramatically or look for validation. He simply gathered his documents, shook Joanna's hand, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back at Karen or her attorney. The victory wasn't in the decision. It was in the principle affirmed that land once lawfully held could not be stripped through implication, perception, or strategy. That control through bureaucracy could be challenged, legally, thoroughly, and with dignity. The fight wasn't over, but it was no longer a siege. It was a reckoning. And Karen now knew that if she wanted to take something from him, she would have to do it honestly, in daylight, and in front of the law. And that was something she was no longer prepared to face. The snow came late that year, a slow, deliberate sweep of white that softened the ridgelines and erased the tension from the trees, covering the land in silence that didn't feel empty, but earned. Landon stood by the kitchen window that morning, watching the flakes settle onto the porch railing, each one a quiet punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had taken almost a year to write. The property was still under active monitoring pending final survey certification, but the worst had passed: the filings, the accusations, the meetings where truth was smothered in subtext. For the first time in months, there were no new letters in his mailbox, no unfamiliar cars idling at the end of his drive, no shadows lurking just outside the range of motion sensors. There was only the quiet and his land and the knowledge that he had not been moved. Not by threats, not by process, and not by the slow erosion of convenience. Karen had not disappeared, but her noise had. Since the court hearing, she had gone dark. Her so-called oversight group had been suspended from county recognition pending further review, and the website promoting her conservation easement proposal had been taken down within a week of the decision. Her lawyer had quietly filed to withdraw from the case, and word had reached Landon through unofficial channels that she had put her home on the market, asking price higher than the land was worth, signaling that she wasn't leaving out of necessity, but spite. He hadn't spoken to her since the courthouse, and he didn't plan to. There was nothing left to say. The new boundary markers had gone in 2 days earlier, placed by an independent crew hired through the court's land management board. They worked quickly, respectfully, and without commentary. When the last marker was set at the dry creek, a gleaming metal rod with a GPS tag and an engraved plate confirming it as the official legal edge of his parcel, one of the crewmen nodded at Landon and said simply, "Clean line now." And that was the closure he needed. Not a confrontation, not an apology, just confirmation, just truth, recorded and recognized. Landon had no desire to become a symbol or a cautionary tale. He didn't join town councils or write about his experience online. He kept his head down, finished repairs on the storage shed, ordered the lumber that had been backlogged for months, and returned to the routine that had once felt so distant. Early mornings with strong coffee, slow walks through frost-covered grass, hands busy with work that didn't serve anyone but himself. But he also didn't forget. He kept every document, every photograph, every transcript and time-stamped file in a locked drawer in his study, not out of paranoia, but memory. The truth had nearly been taken from him, not through force, but through strategy. And that made it all the more dangerous. And if it happened once, it could happen again. Not necessarily to him, but to someone else. So he prepared. Quietly. Thoroughly. He maintained contact with Joanna, not weekly, but regularly enough to stay informed. He retained the private surveyor for an annual review cycle. He joined a statewide landowner registry that flagged suspicious procedural motions attached to rural parcels. Not out of fear, out of understanding. One afternoon in January, a man from the county assessor's office dropped by unannounced. Middle-aged, new to the department, holding a folder and looking slightly out of place in the snow. He'd come to verify physical improvements noted in the last tax cycle. "Standard procedure," he said. Landon walked him around the property, explained the grading, the drainage upgrades, the materials used. The man took notes, asked a few questions, and then paused near the clearing by the creek. "This the spot?" he asked, nodding toward the line. "It was," Landon replied. The man squinted into the sun. "Heard it got ugly." Landon didn't confirm or deny. He just said, "It didn't get me." The man didn't press. He nodded, snapped a photo of the newly installed marker, and moved on. That night, Landon sat on the porch long after the temperature dropped below freezing. Wrapped in a thick coat, a wool blanket draped over his knees, and a slow-burning log in the fire pit beside him. The land stretched out before him, quiet and silver under the moonlight. No cameras hummed, no sensors blinked, no alarms waited to be triggered. The forest line stood where it always had, unchanged by the year's war of paper and silence. And in that stillness, Landon allowed himself a single smile. Not of victory, but of endurance. Because what he had held on to was never just the land. It was the right to be left alone, the right to defend something without raising a weapon, and the knowledge that some lines, once drawn, are not meant to be crossed. Not by neighbors, not by committees, not by those who confuse civility with control. And when the snow fell again the next morning, soft and sure across the edge of his porch, it fell on his land and no one else's.